The day I found out my grandmother left everything to me. My mother stopped speaking to me. That was 3 years ago. I was 26 years old. I was sitting in a conference room in downtown Nashville in a chair that was too big for me, wearing a blazer. I had bought the night before at a consignment shop because I did not own anything appropriate for a reading of a will. See, the attorney across from me was a man named Graham Faust, who had been my grandmother's lawyer for 31 years and who had kind eyes behind thick glasses and who slid a document across the table with both hands like he was offering me something fragile. My mother sat 2 seats to my left. My Uncle Robert sat across from her. They both had their own attorneys. They had known this meeting was coming for 2 weeks, and they had arrived prepared. I had arrived with a blazer from a consignment shop and no idea what was about to happen. My grandmother's name was Louise Calloway. She was 83 years old when she died. She had grown up poor in eastern Tennessee, and she had made herself not poor through a combination of stubbornness and precision and a particular talent for understanding what things were actually worth versus what people said they were worth. She had bought land when land was cheap, and she had held it when everyone told her to sell, and she had sold it when everyone told her to hold, and she had been right about all of it. She was also the only person in my family who had ever asked me what I thought. Not what I wanted, what I thought. She had a way of sitting across from me at her kitchen table and saying, "Now tell me what you actually think about this," and then waiting. Really waiting. And not performing patience while she prepared her response. Actually listening to mine. I thought about that while Graham Faust slid the document across the table. I thought about her kitchen table and the way she waited, and I thought about how much I missed her already and how strange it was to be sitting in a conference room 3 weeks after her funeral, receiving whatever she had decided to leave behind. What she had decided to leave behind was everything. The land, the investments, the house she had lived in for 50 years, the portfolio she had built over 3 decades of careful decisions. All of it, to me. My mother made a sound when Graham Faust read that section. It was a short, sharp sound that she immediately suppressed. She pressed her lips together and she looked at the table and she did not look at me. My Uncle Robert's attorney leaned over and whispered something in his ear. Robert nodded once. He did not look at me either. I looked at Graham Faust. Zig. He looked back at me over his thick glasses. He said quietly, "Do you have any questions?" I said, "I have a lot of questions." He said, "We can take as much time as you need." We took a long time. My name is Vivian Calloway. I am 29 years old. I grew up in Clarksville, Tennessee, which is a city of about 100,000 people north of Nashville that most people outside of Tennessee have never heard of. First, I have brown hair that my mother always called auburn and that I have always called brown because I have never been interested in the more romantic version of the truth. I work in logistics management for a distribution company. I am good at my job because I am good at understanding what things are actually worth, and I learned that from my grandmother, and I learned it early. Family! I want to tell you about my family before I tell you about the will, because the will makes sense only inside the family, and the family is not a simple story. My mother's name is Patricia. She is 54 years old, and she is the kind of woman who leads with her grievances. Not aggressively. She doesn't yell or make scenes. She carries her grievances the way some people carry their phone. Always in hand, always available, always ready to reference at a moment's notice. CIT will tell you about a slight from 1987 with the same fresh injury she would bring to something that happened this morning. She loved Louise the way complicated daughters love complicated mothers, with intensity and distance simultaneously. She wanted her mother's approval and resented needing it, and expressed both of those things in ways that made every family gathering feel like the last 20 minutes of a long drive where everyone needs to stop, but nobody wants to be the one to say so. Dino, my Uncle Robert, is Patricia's younger brother. He is 51, and he has the specific quality of a man who has spent his whole life being the charming one, and who has never fully developed anything underneath the charm because the charm always got him what he needed before the underneath was required. He is handsome in the way that men who have never had to work particularly hard for anything are. Handsome, easy, uncomplicated surface. Nothing wrong with him exactly. Nothing particularly there either. Both of them had expected to inherit from Louise, not because she had promised them anything specifically, because they had assumed. The assumption was so total and so long-standing that it had become, in their minds, a kind of prefact, a thing that was true before it was confirmed. They had built their financial decisions, to varying degrees, on the foundation of what they expected to receive. I had not expected anything. 4. I had visited my grandmother because I loved her. I had driven the 40 minutes from Nashville to her house in Gallatin on Sundays because her kitchen table was the place in my life where someone actually waited for my answer. I had helped her with her garden and her mail and occasionally her finances, not because I was positioning for anything, but because she needed help and I was the one who showed up. I did not know that she was watching. 6. I did not know until Graham Faust slid the document across the table that Louise Calloway had been watching very carefully for a very long time. I need to tell you about my father, not because my father is central to the will or to what happened after, but because understanding my family requires understanding that my father left when I was 11 and that his leaving changed the structure of everything. His name was Dennis. He was not a bad man. 2. He was a man who had married my mother when they were both very young and who had found, after a decade of marriage and one child, that he was someone different from who he had believed himself to be when he made those choices. He left for a woman he had met at work. The situation was as common as situations get. The leaving was as painful as leaving always is. My mother did not recover. Not fully. She managed. CID worked and she raised me and she kept the house and she did what needed to be done. But the leaving had produced in her a particular kind of brittleness that had not been there before. A vigilance against future betrayal that was so acute it sometimes created the very conditions it was guarding against. She and Louise had always had a complicated relationship. After Dennis left, it became more complicated. Theories helped financially in ways that were necessary and delivered in ways that felt like judgment. My mother accepted the help because she had to and resented the conditions because she was human, and that is the particular kind of relationship dynamic that accumulates injury over decades without any single injury being large enough to address directly. By the time I was in my 20s, my mother and Louise saw each other at holidays and called each other on birthdays and did not talk about anything that mattered. The surface was maintained. The distance beneath it was total. Robert had a different relationship with Louise. He borrowed money from her. Not once, many times over many years. He was good at asking. He was charming about it. 2. He had a way of framing each request as temporary and specific and unrelated to the previous requests, and Louise had given him what he asked for because he was her son, and because she was not unaware that the giving would complicate any future accounting. I did not know about Robert's borrowing until after the will. That is the important detail. I did not know, and Louise had not told me. She had simply watched and waited and made her decisions in her own time with her own reasoning and disclosed none of it to anyone until Graham Faust slid the document across the mahogany table. The 3 weeks between Louise's death and the will reading were the quietest 3 weeks of my life. She had died on a Tuesday morning, peacefully, in the house she had lived in for 50 years, in her own bed, which is the death she would have chosen if she had been offered choices. I was there. 6. I had been staying with her for the last 2 weeks because her home health aide had moved to be closer to her own family, and Louise had not wanted to find a replacement, and I had offered to come. She slept a great deal in those last 2 weeks. When she was awake, she was herself. Clear and specific and direct, and occasionally funny, in the dry way she had always been funny. She asked me once if I was bored. I said no. 6. She said good because she found death much less interesting than people suggested it would be. I said, what did you expect? She said drama, she supposed. She said there wasn't much drama. She said it was mostly just being very tired. She died quietly on a Tuesday morning at 6:42. I was in the kitchen making coffee. I heard nothing. I went to check on her at 7 and she was gone. I called hospice. I called my mother. I sat in Louise's kitchen with the coffee I had made and I looked at the kitchen table and I thought about all the times I had sat across from her at it and told her what I actually thought. The 3 weeks between the death and the reading were quiet because nobody knew what was coming and so nobody was performing yet. There were the arrangements and the small funeral she had specified in writing and the visitors who came to the house and the casseroles that people bring. My mother was present and appropriately grief-stricken, and Robert flew in from Memphis and was charming about everything. Nobody argued, nobody positioned. Nobody said anything about the estate because saying anything about the estate while the body was still recent felt too naked, even for the people who were thinking about it constantly. I was not thinking about it. I was missing Louise and organizing her house and returning borrowed dishes and writing the thank you notes she would have wanted written. Then Graham Faust called and said he was ready whenever we were. My mother's silence after the will reading lasted 11 days. Not complete silence. She texted me twice about practical matters. She answered when I called. She said the necessary words. But the silence underneath was total. Silence of a person who has decided that what has happened is a betrayal so fundamental that she needs time to determine whether the relationship survives it. I understood her silence. I want to say that clearly. I did not agree with it, but I understood it. She had assumed she would receive something significant from her mother's estate. She had been wrong about that assumption. The wrongness of the assumption had not produced reflection about the assumption. Second, had produced injury directed at the person who had received what she had expected to receive. That person was me. On the 12th day, she called. She said she needed to talk to me. She said she thought Graham Faust had made a mistake. She said she thought there might be a clerical error or a document that superseded the one he had read. She said she had spoken to an attorney and the attorney thought there were grounds to contest. I said I didn't think there was a mistake. CE. She said, how could I know? I said because I had spoken to Graham Faust at length after the reading, and he had walked me through the entire document and everything in it was deliberate and specifically worded and there were no superseding documents. My mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, so you knew? I said, I didn't know anything until he read it. She said, but you knew she was going to do something like this. I said, no. I said, I visited grandmother because I loved her. State I had no idea what was in her will. I said, if I had known, I would have told you. My mother said, I find that very difficult to believe. She said it very quietly, which was worse than if she had said it loudly. I said, I understand. I said, I'm sorry, this is painful. I said I didn't ask for this and I would not have arranged for it even if I could have. She said, I need some time. I said, okay. She said, don't call me for a while. I said, okay. See, hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time. Robert's response was different from my mother's. Robert called me 3 days after the will reading. He was warm. He was charming. He was so warm and charming that I understood immediately he wanted something. He said he was so glad we could talk. He said the will had been a shock to everyone, including him. He said he didn't bear me any ill will. He said family was family, and this kind of thing shouldn't come between family. See, I said. I agreed completely. He said there was just one thing he wanted to bring up. He said he hoped I wouldn't take it the wrong way. He said Louise had lent him some money over the years, and he had always intended to pay it back, and obviously with the estate going the way it had gone, he wanted to make sure that was handled fairly. I said, what do you mean by fairly? He said he meant that the money she had lent him was really just an advance on what he would have inherited anyway. Dee, he said in his mind, they essentially canceled each other out. He said he thought I would understand that. I said, how much did she lend you? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said the number. The number was significant. I did not react immediately. I said I would need to look into it. He said, of course. He said he was sure we could work something out like adults. He said again that family was family. I said I would get back to him. I called Graham Faust the next morning. Sid. I said I needed to understand the full picture of what Louise had documented. He said he had been expecting this call. He said to come in. Graham Faust's office was warm and slightly cluttered in the way of offices where the work is genuine and the aesthetics are secondary. He had been practicing law in Nashville for 40 years. He had a photograph on his desk of himself with Louise at what appeared to be some kind of community event 20 years ago. They were both laughing. It was a good photograph. He told me that Louise had kept detailed records of every transaction she had ever made with her children, every loan, every gift, every time she had paid a bill or covered an expense or transferred money. She had kept these records in a ledger that she had updated by hand every time a transaction occurred. The ledger went back 30 years. Robert had borrowed, over the course of those 30 years, a substantial amount of money. Most of it was documented as loans. Some of it had been repaid. Most of it had not. The net outstanding balance was larger than the number Robert had quoted me on the phone. It was significantly larger. My mother had borrowed significantly less. Some of that had been in the form of help after my father left. Help with the mortgage. Help with my school expenses. Some of it had been in the form of smaller, ongoing assistance. Louise had recorded all of it. Graham Faust said Louise had considered the ledger carefully when she made her decisions about the estate. He said she had told him that she had no expectation that the loans would be repaid and she had factored that into the distribution accordingly. He said in her estimation the estate she was leaving me represented approximately what she would have given my mother and uncle if the loans had never happened and if the years of assistance had never occurred. He said she had, in her own way, been keeping and accounting for 30 years. I sat with that for a long time, with the image of Louise at her kitchen table doing what she did, watching, recording, making her assessments quietly and without announcement, deciding what things were actually worth. I said, "Did she tell you why she chose me specifically?" He said she had left a letter. He slid an envelope across the table. Same gesture as the first document. Both hands careful. See, I opened the letter in my car in the parking garage. I sat with the engine off and I read it twice. It was 2 pages long in Louise's handwriting, precise and slightly slanted the way her handwriting had always been. She said she had watched me for years. Not because she was assessing me, because she enjoyed watching me. She said I had a quality that she had spent a long time trying to name and had finally settled on honest attention. She said I noticed things accurately. 6 cent, I did not make them more or less than they were. I did not need them to be different from what they were. I just looked at them clearly and responded to what I actually saw. She said that was the rarest quality she had ever encountered. She said she had spent her whole life around people who needed things to be different from what they were. She said I was the only person in her life who had always seemed to be simply in the room she was actually in rather than the room she wished she were in. CIC. The estate was mine because she trusted me to continue to be in the room I was actually in, to see things as they were, to make decisions based on what was actually there rather than what she had once hoped things might be. She said she was sorry for any difficulty this created. She said she knew it would create difficulty. She said she had made her peace with that, and she hoped I would too. She ended the letter with the phrase she had always used at the end of our kitchen table conversations. She wrote, "Now tell me what you actually think about this." I sat in the parking garage for a long time. Then I started the car. I drove home. I made dinner. I sat at my own kitchen table, and I thought about what I actually thought. What I actually thought was complicated. I was grateful. I was also overwhelmed. I was also sad in a specific way that had to do with the fact that Louise had known all of this and carried it alone and had not told me while she was alive because telling me would have changed the way I showed up, and she had not wanted to change the way I showed up. She had wanted me to show up as myself. So she had told me after. I was also, if I am being honest, frightened. The estate was not a small thing. Managing it responsibly was not a small thing. 6. I was 26 years old and I worked in logistics, and I had an apartment in Nashville with a small balcony where I grew herbs in containers, and I had not, before that conference room, had any expectation that my life would look like this. I did what Louise would have done. I found the right professionals, and I listened to them carefully, and I made decisions based on what was actually there, rather than what I wished were there. I found a financial advisor who had been recommended by Graham Faust and who spent 3 sessions with me before we talked about anything specific, just asking questions, just understanding what I had and what I wanted and what I understood. I learned things in those sessions that Louise had known for decades, about the land and what it produced and what it could produce and what the market for it was and what holding it meant versus selling it. Sixons and their structure and their history and their likely future. About the house in Gallatin and what it was worth and what it cost to maintain and what my options were. I made decisions. Good ones, I think. The land I kept. The investments I reorganized with guidance. The house I thought about for a long time. The house was where my mother and I finally had the real conversation. Not in the house itself. On the porch. 6. She had called me 6 weeks after the will reading and said she wanted to talk. She said she had been thinking about what she wanted to say. She said, could she come to the house in Gallatin? I said yes. I drove out on a Saturday morning, and I opened the house, and I made coffee, and I sat on the porch that looked out over the backfield that Louise had owned for 40 years, and I waited for my mother. She arrived at 10:30. She parked on the gravel drive, and she walked up the porch steps, and she looked at me for a moment, and then she looked at the house, and then she sat down in the other rocking chair. Louise had kept 2 rocking chairs on that porch her whole life. They were old. They had a particular creak that I associated with Sunday afternoons. My mother said, I need to ask you something. I said, okay. She said, do you think she loved me? I said, yes. I said, I think she loved you very much, and I think the love was complicated by everything that happened between you and I. Think she did not know how to say that while she was alive in a way that didn't cost more than she was willing to spend. My mother was quiet. She rocked slightly in the chair. She said she knew about the loans. She said she had always known. She said she had never repaid them because she had told herself they were not really loans. Sether, that a mother helping her daughter after an abandonment was not really a financial transaction. She said she had told herself that for so long she had stopped noticing she was telling it. I said I understood that. She said, do you think she resented me for it? I said, I think she made her peace with it. I said, I think she was very deliberate about everything, including that. My mother looked out at the backfield. She said I wanted to be her favorite. She said I wanted to be the one she chose. See, I said, I know that's a terrible thing to say about your own mother's estate. She said, I know it makes me sound terrible. I said, it makes you sound human. I said, wanting to be chosen by your mother is the most human thing there is. I said, it doesn't make you terrible. I said, it makes you her daughter. My mother cried. Not theatrical, grief-stricken crying, the quiet kind. The kind that has been held back for a while and has finally found a place to go. I didn't say anything. Dean. I just sat with her in the rocking chair that creaked. The field was green in the October light. The oak trees at the edge of it were starting to turn. After a while, my mother said, what are you going to do with the house? I said I was thinking about keeping it for a while. I said I was not ready to sell it yet. She said, what will you do with it? I said I would come on Sundays. She said, like you did with Mama. I said, yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, can I come sometimes? I said, yes. Said I would like that. We sat on that porch for another hour. We talked about Louise, about the specific memories each of us had, about the kitchen table, about the bird feeders Louise kept on the east side of the house and the names she had for the birds, about the pound cake she made for every occasion and the specific way she always acted like it was no trouble. It was the best conversation I had ever had with my mother. Not because we resolved anything exactly, feared. Because we were both in the room, we were actually in 20, which was a porch in Gallatin on an October morning, missing the same woman and telling each other the truth about what that felt like. That was something Louise would have approved of. Robert and I had a different kind of conversation. It happened in Graham Faust's office. 6. Robert had retained his own attorney after the will reading, and there had been a period of correspondence between the attorneys about the loans and what, if anything, they implied in terms of obligations. The correspondence had been professionally correct and had produced nothing conclusive. Robert had called me twice more in the intervening months, both times warm, both times circling toward the same point. He wanted to know what I was going to do about the money he had borrowed. 4. He framed it different ways. He asked if I had thought about what Louise would have wanted. He asked if I had considered what family meant. He asked if I understood how difficult his situation was. I told him each time that I was thinking about it. That was the truth. I was thinking about it. I just wasn't telling him what I was thinking. What I was thinking was that Louise had made her accounting. She had taken the loans into consideration in her distribution. She had decided that the estate I received represented the fair outcome given the full history. She had made that decision deliberately and specifically, and she had documented it, and she had left a letter explaining her reasoning. What I was thinking was that Louise had already answered the question Robert was asking me. He just didn't like the answer. In the meeting at Graham Faust's office, Robert arrived with his attorney and a prepared statement of the amounts he believed constituted the outstanding loans, and a proposed repayment schedule that he wanted me to consider forgiving in exchange for a one-time settlement. Payment that was significantly less than the full amount. I arrived with Graham Faust and Louise's ledger. I let Robert's attorney present the proposal. It was professionally delivered. It had some logic to it. If you accepted certain premises, I let him finish. Then Graham Faust presented Louise's ledger. The full 30 years. Every transaction. The amounts Robert remembered and the amounts he did not remember, and the ones that had been repaid. And the ones that had not, and the current balance, which was significantly different from the number Robert had been working with. Robert's attorney looked at the ledger for a long time. Robert looked at his hands. Then I said something I had prepared. I said that Louise had made her accounting. I said she had decided what was fair, and she had built that decision into her will, and she had done so deliberately. I said I was going to honor her accounting. I said I was not going to pursue the outstanding balance because Louise had already addressed it in the way she chose to address it. I said the ledger was being kept on file, but I was not going to use it as the basis for any legal action. Sadie, I said in exchange for that decision, I needed Robert to release any further claim or contestation of the will. I said I needed him to acknowledge that the will was valid and the distribution was Louise's deliberate and considered choice. Robert's attorney conferred with Robert quietly. Then he said his client would agree to that. Robert looked at me across the table. He said, "Thank you." I said, "You're welcome." I said, "I hope you're well." He said he was. He said family was family. I said, "Yes, it is." Furies, we shook hands. He left. I sat in Graham Faust's office for a few minutes. Graham poured us both a cup of coffee. He looked at the ledger on the table. He said Louise would have handled that exactly the way you just handled it. I said, I hoped so. He said she would. It has been 3 years since the will reading. I go to the house in Gallatin on Sundays. My mother comes sometimes. We sit on the porch in the rocking chairs that creak. We drink coffee. We talk about things, field and the oak trees at the edge of it. She asked me once what Louise and I had talked about all those years at the kitchen table. I told her the truth. I said Louise would ask me what I actually thought about something, and then she would wait for the answer. Really wait. My mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said I never knew how to do that. I said I know. I said I think that was hard for her. She said it was hard for me too. We sat with that. Not trying to fix it. Just sitting with the truth of it. The house needs work in places. The roof on the back section has a section that will need attention in the next year or two. The garden that Louise kept has reduced to the things that survive on their own. Wild roses along the fence. Some native plantings that don't require management. The herb garden is gone, except for the lavender, which has spread considerably on its own initiative. I have been thinking about what to do with the house long term. Seeds, I am not ready to decide. Louise would tell me not to decide until I was ready. She would say the house is not going anywhere. She would say, let the seasons tell you what you need to know. I am letting the seasons tell me. What I know so far is this. I am 29 years old and I own 2 acres of field in Gallatin and a house my grandmother lived in for 50 years and a portfolio of investments that she built through 30 years of watching and waiting and understanding what things were actually worth. I am the person she chose after watching carefully for a very long time. I try to deserve that choice every day. Not dramatically, just by doing what she taught me. By being in the room I am actually in. By noticing things accurately. By making decisions based on what is actually there rather than what I wish were there. By telling the truth about what I actually think, she taught me that. She sat across from me at the kitchen table for 15 years, and she taught me that. It is the most valuable thing anyone has ever given me. More valuable than the land or the investments or the house with the creaking rocking chairs. I sit on the porch on Sunday mornings and I think about what she would ask me if she were here. I think about what I would say. I think about the field and the oak trees and the lavender that has spread along the fence on its own initiative. I think about Marcus, the 9-year-old boy in a different story entirely, whose story I heard from a nurse who used to sit at this kind of table. I think about ordinary Tuesdays and what it means to have them. I think about what Louise knew about what things are actually worth that it took me 26 years to begin to understand. I think she was the most remarkable person I have ever known. I think she was lonely in ways she never described to me directly, but that I felt in the quality of her attention. I think she was loved imperfectly by people who loved her genuinely. I think she made her peace with that, and she decided to put her trust in the one person who had always just shown up as herself. I was just myself. She taught me to be just myself. It is the best she could have done for me. Scenes on Sunday mornings. The field is the first thing I see when I come out with my coffee. It is green in summer and gold in autumn and bare in winter and green again in spring, and it does not care about any of the things that happened in that conference room 3 years ago. It just does what it does. In each season, without needing anything from me except to be looked at honestly. I look at it honestly. My name is Vivian Calloway. My grandmother's name was Louise. Asked me what I actually thought. She waited for the answer. That was the whole gift. That was everything. I want to tell you about the first Sunday I went back to the house after the will reading. It was 3 weeks after the conference room. The weather was that specific kind of Tennessee October that feels like a gift. Cool enough for a jacket in the morning. Warm enough to take it off by noon. The drive from Nashville takes about 40 minutes on the highway and then 10 minutes on the county road that runs through fields and past houses with long driveways. I knew the drive so well, I had stopped noticing it years ago. That Sunday, I noticed it again. I was arriving differently. Not as a granddaughter visiting, as something I didn't have a word for yet. Something that felt like responsibility, but not the heavy kind. The kind that comes from being trusted with something real. Siri, the house key had been in my possession since Louise died. Graham Faust had given it to me after the arrangements were finished. I had put it on my keyring next to my apartment key and my car key, and I had felt its specific weight every time I reached into my pocket. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open, and the smell of the house was exactly as it had always been. Sold wood and the particular scent of a house that has been lived in for 50 years by someone who cooked and kept cut flowers and used the same soap her whole adult life. I stood in the entryway for a minute. I looked at the hallway that led to the kitchen. I looked at the living room to the left. I looked at the stairs. Then I went to the kitchen and I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table, her chair, and my chair. I sat in my chair. I put my hands flat on the table the way she used to when she was preparing to say something she had been thinking about for a while. I looked at her chair. The field was visible through the window above the sink, green and gold and moving slightly in the October wind. I thought about the letter, about the phrase she had used at the end. Now tell me what you actually think about this. I thought about what I actually thought. I thought I was scared. I thought I did not know if I was capable of managing what she had left me. I thought I was 26 years old and I had grown up in Clarksville and I had a degree in business logistics and an apartment with herbs on the balcony, and I did not feel like someone who was supposed to end up here. I also thought I understood exactly why she had chosen me, and understanding it was its own kind of weight. Not a bad weight. The weight of something real that needs to be carried carefully. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The coffee got cold. I didn't make another cup. I just sat. Then I went outside to the porch, and I sat in the rocking chair that creaked, and I looked at the field and the oak trees at the edge of it, and I said out loud to nobody in particular, I will try to deserve this. I do not know if Louise heard that. I do not know what I believe about what comes after. But I said it, and I meant it, and I have meant it every Sunday since. The financial education that followed, the will reading, was its own kind of story. I had always been reasonably good with money in the specific way of someone who grew up without much of it. I knew how to budget. I knew how to avoid unnecessary expense. I knew how to save steadily in the way that Louise had taught me, by example, not by lecture. Just by being someone who did it consistently and who explained the reasoning when I asked. But managing a small personal budget and managing an estate were completely different skill sets. The estate had real estate and investments and tax implications and fiduciary responsibilities, and about a dozen other categories of complexity that I had to learn from scratch. I was not embarrassed by not knowing. Louise had not been embarrassed by not knowing things when she started either. She had found the right people and listened carefully and asked the questions that needed asking, and over time she had built the knowledge. I did the same thing. The financial advisor Graham Faust recommended was a woman named Carol who had been practicing in Nashville for 20 years. She was patient and specific, and she had a gift for explaining things without making you feel stupid for not already knowing them. She reminded me a little of Louise in that way. The quality of genuine teaching that comes from someone who actually wants you to understand rather than just to comply. Carol spent the first 3 sessions asking me questions. Not about the estate. About me. About what I understood and what I wanted and what I was afraid of and what I was hoping for. She said she needed to understand who I was before she could help me understand what I had. I appreciated that approach enormously. It felt right in the specific way that Louise's kitchen table had always felt right. Someone actually wanting to know what was in your head before proceeding. After those 3 sessions, we started working through the estate. Carol walked me through every piece. The land and its current value and what it was producing and what it could produce and what the tax implications of various decisions were. The investments and their history and their structure and what changes, if any, she recommended. The house and its maintenance costs and its assessed value and what my options were. I made some changes and left some things as they were. Carol said my instincts were good. She said I had a natural understanding of what was worth holding and what was worth moving. I told her I had learned that from my grandmother. She said it showed. I have not talked much about Derek. Derek is a man I was dating when the will reading happened. He had been in my life for about 8 months. He was 32. He worked in finance. He was intelligent and well-dressed and had a way of making plans that made you feel like you were in good hands. When I told him about the will, his response was immediate and enthusiastic. He said this was incredible news. He said he had always believed in my potential. He said this changed everything. He said we should think seriously about our future. He said with resources like this, we had real options. I noticed the we, Steedy had not used we that way before. Steed's 8 months in, and the we had been casual and comfortable. The we that appeared after I told him about the will was a different kind of we. More structural, more determined. I didn't say anything about it that night. I listened to what he said, and I nodded in the right places, and I went home thinking, over the next several weeks, Derek became more present in a way that was hard to object to directly. He offered to help with things. He suggested people I should talk to, Steedy. He made comments about the land and the house and the investments that revealed a familiarity with the details that I had not given him but that he had clearly been researching. He was not crude about it. He was not overtly calculating in any way that could be directly named. He was just persistently more interested in my financial situation than he had been before the will reading and less interested in me specifically. I noticed the way Louise had taught me to notice things. Today, I did not make it more or less than it was. I just saw it clearly. One evening, he said something about a business idea he had been developing. He said with the right capital backing, it could be significant. He said he had been thinking about who he knew who might be in a position to participate. He said in the right circumstances, family often made the best partners in that kind of venture. We had been dating for 8 months. I was not his family. I ended the relationship 2 weeks later. State, kindly, clearly, without drama. I said I didn't think we were right for each other. He said he was surprised. He said he thought we had real potential. I said I knew. I said I was sorry. He called once after that. He said he felt like he deserved more of an explanation. I said I had given him the explanation I had. He said he felt like there was something I wasn't saying. I said there might be something I wasn't saying. I said sometimes that was how it was. He didn't call again. I thought about Louise after that conversation. About what she would have made of Derek. About whether she would have named what I had seen or whether she would have just waited and let me arrive at it myself. I thought she would have waited. She would have trusted me to see it. She would have been right to trust me to see it. I saw it. My friend Janelle has been my closest friend since college. She is one of those people who respond to major news with the correct amount of emotion rather than the socially expected amount. When I told her about the will, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, wow. She said, that's a lot to carry. She said, how are you actually? Not, what does this mean for you financially? Not, what are you going to do? How are you actually? I told her the truth. Then I said I was scared and overwhelmed and also incredibly grateful and also sad because the thing had happened because Louise was gone and I would give it back in a second if it meant she was still at her kitchen table. Janelle said, that makes complete sense. She said, all of those things can be true at once. I said, yes, they can. Janelle came to the house in Gallatin with me once in the first year. She sat on the porch and she looked at the field and she said, I understand why you come here. Said, why? She said it feels like the kind of place where things are what they are. I said yes. I said that was exactly it. She stayed for the afternoon. We made lunch from what was in the refrigerator and we sat at the kitchen table and we talked. See, she sat in Louise's chair without knowing it was Louise's chair and I looked at her sitting there and I thought about how the kitchen table had always been where the real conversations happened and how some things stay true about a place even after the person who made it true is gone. Janelle asked me once what I thought Louise would say if she could see how things had unfolded. I thought about it for a while. Then I said, I think she would say, I'm not surprised. I think she would say she had done her accounting and made her decision and she trusted the math. Janelle said she sounds like someone who is very good at being right. I said yes. I said she was also very good at knowing that being right doesn't mean everything goes smoothly. She built her life on that understanding. She made her peace with the difficulty, and she made her decisions anyway. I said I was trying to do the same thing. Janelle said, I think you are. Yeah. She said she thought Louise had chosen well. I said I hoped so. Sundays, I was going to keep showing up on Sundays and keep sitting at the table and keep asking myself what I actually thought until I was sure I was living up to the trust. She said that sounded like the right plan. I said it was Louise's plan. She said no. She said it was mine now. The lavender along the back fence has continued to spread. This is what lavender does when you leave it alone in the right soil. Fears it does not require management. It requires only that you do not impede it. I have adopted this as a kind of principle for the whole property. Do not impede what is working. Pay careful attention to what isn't. Make changes slowly and with full information. Let the seasons tell you what you need to know. Fate. This is also, I realize, the principle. Louise applied to her financial decisions and to her family relationships and to the long, careful watching she did for decades before. She made the decision she made. Do not impede what is working. Pay attention to what isn't. Make decisions slowly and with full information. I am her granddaughter. I am more like her than I knew before the kitchen table became mine. The house needs the roof work this coming spring. Second, I have found a contractor in Gallatin who came recommended by the neighbor 2 properties over who has lived on his land for 40 years and who knew Louise well. He walked the roof with me and told me what he saw and what it would cost and what would happen if it was not addressed. He was specific and honest and did not oversell. I told him to schedule the work for April. He said that would work fine. These are the ordinary decisions of someone who owns a house. Skeep, I am learning to be the person who makes them. It is slower than I expected and more interesting than I expected. Every decision requires understanding something I did not understand before. Every question answered opens to more questions. It is, in this sense, exactly like Louise's kitchen table. The conversation never reached an endpoint. It just kept going deeper. I am not in a hurry for it to reach an endpoint. My name is Vivian Calloway. I am 29 years old. I have brown hair that some people call auburn, and I have never been interested in the more romantic version of the truth. I own a field and a house in Gallatin, Tennessee, and investments that my grandmother built through 30 years of watching carefully and understanding what things were actually worth. She left it to me because she trusted me to be in the room I was actually in. I am in that room. Every Sunday morning with my coffee, every time I sit at the kitchen table and look out at the field, every time I make a decision based on what is actually there rather than what I wish were there. Every time someone asks me a question and I take a breath and I tell the truth, that is the whole story. That is everything she gave me. The land and the investments and the house were the surface of it. Underneath was something more durable than any of those things. She gave me the habit of telling the truth. Louise gave me the practice of being in the room I was actually in. That is what a grandmother can give you if she is paying attention. Louise was always paying attention. I am trying to do the same. I want to tell you something about the will that I have not told anyone except Graham Faust. In the document, there was a section that addressed what would happen to the estate if I predeceased Louise. Standard legal language. It named a secondary beneficiary for that contingency. Secondary beneficiary was not my mother. It was not Robert. It was the pediatric oncology ward at Vanderbilt Children's Hospital. I have thought about that section more than any other part of the document, not because it affects anything in the present, because of what it reveals about how Louise thought she had considered every possibility. She had thought about what happened if the person she trusted was not there. CHT had decided that if neither her daughter, nor her son, nor her granddaughter could be the steward of what she had built, then the right steward was the place where people cared for sick children. The place where the work was genuine and the need was real and the resources would be used without waste. That choice tells me everything about what Louise valued. Not family in the abstract. Not blood in the abstract. The work that was genuine. The need that was real. The resource used without waste. She had watched her children for 30 years. She had recorded every loan in the ledger. She had made her accounting, and when she decided who to trust, she had asked herself who would use this well, who would be in the room they were actually in, who would make decisions based on what was actually there. She found that person in me. She had a backup in children with cancer. Both choices were consistent. Both were about the work being genuine. Things. I think about that when I am sitting at the kitchen table, when I am looking at the ledger that Graham Faust gave me after the meeting with Robert, when I am making decisions about the land or the investments or the roof that needs to be done in April. I ask myself what Louise asked herself. Is the work genuine? Is the need real? Will this be used without waste? Most of the time, I think I am getting it right. Sometimes I am not sure. The uncertainty is part of it. Louise was not certain either. Feed made her peace with the uncertainty, and she made her decisions anyway, and she trusted her own accounting. I am learning to do the same. My mother came to the house in Gallatin again last month. She comes more regularly now. Not every Sunday, but often enough that it has become a rhythm. She brings things sometimes. A pie from a bakery she likes. Flowers from a farmer's market. Once she brought a bird feeder. See, she hung the bird feeder on the hook that had been empty on the east side of the porch since Louise died. Louise had kept a feeder there her whole life. The hook was still there. I had looked at the empty hook every Sunday, and I had not replaced the feeder because replacing it had felt like a decision I was not ready to make. My mother hung it without asking. She filled it with seed from a bag she had brought with her. She hung it on the hook and stood back and looked at it. CSA, she said, your grandmother used to name the birds. I said, I know. She said, did she ever tell you what she named them? I said, no. She said, we had names for them when we were children. She said, I remember them all. She told me the names. Old names from a childhood I had never witnessed. Names that were specific to the birds that came to that particular feeder on that particular porch. Some of them were the actual bird names, and some of them were names Louise and Robert and my mother had invented when they were small, and that had stuck through decades. I listened to all of them. I thought they were the most important things I had learned in months. We sat on the porch for the rest of the afternoon. The birds came to the feeder. My mother named them. I learned the names. That is the thing about grief that I was not prepared for. That it does not diminish what is gone. Instead, it keeps producing things. Pieces of the person that you did not know existed that surface over time in the people who were near them. Louise's bird names in my mother's mouth on a November afternoon. Things that were Louise's becoming mine through my mother. The inheritance continuing to move. I have been thinking about what I owe my mother. Not in the legal sense. Nothing in the legal sense. In the human sense that asks what it means to be the person who received something the other person expected to receive and what that creates in terms of obligation. I do not have a clean answer. I do not think there is a clean answer. What I have is the willingness to sit on the porch and listen to the bird names and let her come when she wants to come, and make coffee when she arrives and be in the room I am actually in when she is in it with me. That is what Louise would have done. It is what Louise did for me. The full attention. The actual waiting. The real presence in the room. I am trying to give my mother some of what Louise gave me. Not all of it. I am not Louise. I am 29 years old and I am still learning how to be in the room I am actually in, and some days I am better at it than others, but I am trying. And my mother, to her credit, is trying too. She is showing up differently than she used to. Less armored. More willing to say things that are true. More willing to sit with the uncomfortable and let it be what it is. We are both still learning. I think we are learning from the same teacher. We are just in different sessions. I keep the blue binder, not Louise's binder. She didn't have a blue binder. That was a different story. I keep a notebook. Spiral. Blue cover. I have kept it since the will reading. In it, I write things I notice, things I am thinking about, decisions I am considering, and the reasoning behind them. Sometimes things, Louise said, that I remember. It is not as organized as Louise's ledger. It is not as precise. It is more like thinking on paper than like record keeping. But it serves the same function. It keeps me in the room I am actually in. It makes me put my actual thoughts into actual words. It makes me honest with myself because when you write something down, you cannot pretend you didn't think it. Louise's ledger is in a fireproof box in my apartment in Nashville. Instead, alongside the will and the letter she wrote. Alongside the deed to the property in Gallatin. These are the documents. These are the paper record of everything. The notebook is the other record, the one that does not have legal weight, the one that is just me, talking to myself, trying to figure out what I actually think. Louise would recognize it. She would sit across from me and she would ask to see it. I think I would show her. She would read it the way she read everything, carefully and without rushing, and then she would look up at me over her glasses and she would say something specific and true and short. I miss that. Same. I miss having someone who would read the notebook and say something specific and true and short. I am trying to be that person for myself. It is harder. The specific and true and short part is harder when you are both the one asking and the one answering. But I am trying. Every Sunday, every time I sit at the kitchen table, every time I look at the field and ask myself what I actually think. My name is Vivian Calloway. I am 29 years old. I have brown hair, I own a field in Gallatin and a house my grandmother lived in for 50 years and investments she built through 30 years of watching carefully. She gave them to me because she trusted me to be in the room I was actually in. I am in that room. I intend to stay in it. The field is there every Sunday. These of the oak trees are there. The bird feeder is there now with the birds my mother named for me. The lavender is spreading along the back fence on its own initiative. The roof will be done in April. Everything is what it is. I am trying to see it that way. That is the whole story. That is everything. That is all of it. There is one more thing I want to tell you about Louise. The thing I have saved for last because it is the most important thing and I wanted everything else to be said first. She was not a perfect person. I want to say that clearly because this story could become the story of a saintly grandmother who dispensed wisdom and resources and did everything right and left, a grateful granddaughter with a field in Gallatin and a beautiful inheritance. That is not the complete story. The complete story includes the fact that Louise had made genuine mistakes with her children. She had been harder on my mother than was fair after Dennis left. She had helped in ways that felt like judgment because they came with the particular tone of someone who believed they knew better. She had lent Robert money in ways that enabled rather than helped, because enabling is sometimes easier than the alternative, and sometimes the alternative requires a confrontation that a person cannot find the energy for. She had loved her children imperfectly the way that most people love their children, TP with the limitations of her own wounds and assumptions, and the particular blind spots of someone who had grown up without resources and who had a complicated relationship with what money meant and what it said about a person. She had made her peace with her mistakes. I believe that. The ledger is part of the peacemaking. The deliberateness of the will is part of the peacemaking. The letter she wrote to me is part of it. She had looked at the whole accounting and she had made the decisions she made. And she had written down what she thought and she had died in her own bed on a Tuesday morning. What I am trying to tell you is that I did not inherit from a perfect woman. I inherited from a real one. The distinction matters to me because I am not a perfect person either. I am 29 years old and I make mistakes and I will make more mistakes and some of them will be significant and some will be invisible and the ledger I keep of my own life will be complicated. What Louise gave me was not the model of a perfect person. It was the model of a person who paid honest attention and made her decisions accordingly and did not pretend the accounting was cleaner than it was. That is a more durable inheritance than perfection. Perfection is not something you can pass on. Honest attention is, I am trying to pass it on in the ways available to me. To Janelle when she asks how I actually am. To my mother when she comes to the porch. To the contractor who will do the roof work in April when I tell him what I actually noticed when we walked the surface together. To Carol, my financial advisor, when she asks what I am thinking about a particular decision. Sipped to myself on Sunday mornings. When I sit at the kitchen table and look at the field and write in the blue spiral notebook what I actually think. It is a practice. It is daily. It does not produce perfection. It produces the specific comfort of knowing that I am seeing what is actually there and that I am responding to what I actually see. That is what Louise had. That is what she wanted to give to someone. Second, that is why she watched and waited and made her accounting and slid the document across the table with both hands. She found someone who would do it right. She was not certain. She was never certain. She trusted her assessment and she made the decision and she left a letter. I am trying to deserve the letter. I will keep trying. Every Sunday. Every season. Spring when the lavender does what lavender does, and every October when the oak trees turn, and every April when the roof gets done, and every Tuesday morning when I wake up in Nashville and think about what needs to be done and do it without making it more or less than it is. My name is Vivian Calloway. My grandmother's name was Louise. She grew up poor in eastern Tennessee, and she made herself not poor through stubbornness and precision and a particular talent for understanding what things were actually worth. She gave me what she made. She gave me what she knew. She gave me the practice of honest attention. I am in the room I am actually in. That is the whole story. That is everything. That is all of it. Last Sunday, the light came through the oak trees at a particular angle I had not seen before. Or perhaps I had seen it and had not noticed it in quite the same way. The way light works in a specific place changes slightly with every season, and you have to be paying attention. On the right morning, at the right hour, to catch a version of it that you have not caught before. I was on the porch with my coffee when it happened. Sun was just high enough to come through the gap between the two largest oaks, and it fell across the front field in a way that made the grass look like it was lit from below rather than above, like the light was coming up through the ground rather than down through the sky. I sat very still. I did not take a photograph. I just looked at it. Louise would have had a name for that particular quality of light. She had names for things. The specific name of each bird at the feeder. State the name of the particular angle of light in late October when the oaks start to turn. The name of the silence that settles over the field in the first hour after heavy rain. I do not have names for all of these things yet. I am accumulating them. Every Sunday adds to the vocabulary. Every season teaches me something I did not know the season before. By the time I am Louise's age, I will have 30 years of Sundays. 30 years of the field and the oak trees and the light through the gap between them. That is not nothing. That is a significant inheritance of knowledge, not financial knowledge. The knowledge of a specific place across a long span of time. The knowledge of what something is year by year and season by season, and how it changes and how it stays the same. Louise had that knowledge. I am building mine. I will build it the way she built hers, by showing up, by paying attention, by being in the room I am actually in, by writing down what I actually think in the blue spiral notebook, by asking myself the question she always asked and waiting honestly for the answer. Now tell me what you actually think about this. I think the light through the oak trees on Sunday morning is the most beautiful thing I have seen all week. I think the field is doing what fields do, and the lavender is spreading, and the birds have names now. Fort. I think I am 29 years old, and I have been trusted with something real, and I am going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that trust. I think Louise was right about me. I think she saw something that I am still in the process of becoming. I think that is what she trusted. Not who I was, but who I was becoming. The direction of the becoming. I am becoming someone who can hold this. I am not there yet. I am getting closer every Sunday. The field is still there. The oak trees are still there. The light through the gap is still there when the angle is right, and I am paying attention. My name is Vivian Calloway. I am paying attention. That is the whole story. That is everything. State is all of it.